TikTok is at a crossroads. Concerns about its Chinese ownership have been building since 2020.
TikTok's been in this limbo for 2 years, and who knows how many more months or years it could stay in this limbo.
And a panel of US officials is torn on how to address them. If they can't come to an agreement, there's another possible solution: forcing TikTok to become a US company. Here's what it would take to make that happen, and why that move poses some big challenges. First, a brief review of how TikTok's data is managed, which is the main focus for US officials.
TikTok's this huge company, but it's owned by a Chinese parent company called ByteDance. They run several apps, but TikTok's probably their best known one in the world.
ByteDance itself is headquartered in Beijing and is owned by investors from around the globe. A Chinese state-controlled entity owns 1% of a Beijing-based subsidiary of ByteDance. Those connections are what some are worried about, and for a couple of reasons.
The first concern is that the Chinese government could order TikTok to hand over data about individual American users. So what kind of videos they watch, and maybe even their IP addresses, which could identify their location. The second big thing is the video recommendation algorithm. And the idea is that the Chinese government could order TikTok to control what videos Americans could watch.
TikTok says it has already started to address some of those concerns. The company recently said that all US user traffic is now being routed through cloud servers operated by the US-based company Oracle. And TikTok says that only members of its US data security team have access to that data. But backups are still being saved to other non-Oracle servers in the US and Singapore, the company says. But it's phasing those out. As for TikTok's recommendation algorithm, that was created by its Chinese parent company ByteDance. TikTok says changes to the algorithm are monitored by Oracle before they're implemented in the US app.
So anytime there's a change to the algorithm that influences what kind of videos Americans see, they say that Oracle will have full access to see, what the algorithm does.
A spokesperson for the Chinese Foreign Ministry said in a press conference in November in regards to TikTok that spreading disinformation and then using it to hobble Chinese companies has become a go-to tool for the US government. But some US lawmakers still want TikTok to have more separation from China. One option is a divestiture order, or a forced sale, which could cut ties to Chinese ownership.
The Chinese government would theoretically have less power over TikTok to force TikTok to do something like spy or control what videos Americans watch.
A divestiture order is what happened to the dating app Grindr in 2019, after US officials determined that the app's personal data could potentially be exploited for blackmail, since the majority stakeholder was a Chinese company. Here's how the process has worked in past cases. First, an executive body branch called the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS, opens a case with the involved companies. This is the panel that's been talking to TikTok. It's made up of representatives of 9 U.S. departments and agencies, led by the Treasury, and reviews foreign transactions to see if they might be a national security risk. After CFIUS reviews a company or merger, it can make recommendations to mitigate those risks, which can include asking foreign investors or owners to sell their stake in the company. In extreme cases, it can also escalate the case to the president, who can order a forced sale. That owner then has to find a suitable buyer, usually one within the US. Then the buyer and seller might have to go back to CFIUS in order to get the sale approved. Grindr took just over a year after the order was made to find a buyer and get approval. The president never issued an order. But TikTok is a much bigger name, and forcing a sale could be more complicated.
There's been nothing of this scale, this popularity. Usually, CFIUS deals with a lot smaller cases here. So this is like the case of the century for CFIUS lawyers in Washington, D.C.
A Treasury official said that CFIUS does not publicly comment on transactions that it may or may not be reviewing. Officials are worried about a number of challenges facing a forced sale. One is that the Trump administration already tried it.
They have till September 15th to make a deal. After that, we close it up in this country.
In 2020, that administration issued an order that would have effectively banned TikTok unless it sold itself to a U.S. buyer. But TikTok pushed back and took the order to a federal appeals court, arguing that the deal denied the company due process. It was still tied up in legal issues by the time Joe Biden got into office, and the order was shelved as his administration conducted its own security review. But his administration could face similar pushback from TikTok if it tries to force a sale, and doing so could risk diluting CFIUS's authority.
There are powers based on having these vague, broad powers, and if they go to court, even if they win in court, a court might put parameters on that power, might define that power, because the more vague your power is, the more powerful it is.
Even without legal hurdles, a sale would also need cooperation from the Chinese government, which has the power to restrict the exports of technology, such as TikTok's video recommendation algorithm.
If China does not allow the algorithm to be sold, then can TikTok continue operating in the US? We don't know. We're in totally uncharted waters right now.
While CFIUS decides what to do, some lawmakers have taken concerns into their own hands. TikTok has been banned on government devices in a majority of states. And in December, the federal government implemented a similar ban.
The only sensible next step is for this Congress to act to make that ban across the board for all federal devices.
At least one bill has been introduced to ban TikTok entirely in the United States.
That has legal problems too. That could potentially face a First Amendment problem. Can you actually ban TikTok from operating in the US, especially when it has more than 100 million American users?
While TikTok has made concessions, including how its data is managed, to get to an agreement with CFIUS, talks are ongoing without a clear deadline.